Hello and good morning. Of course, this is Mountain Standard Time, and I'm your host, Nathan Giede. Today, I'm going to be talking with Reid Small. He is one of our contributors from British Columbia, and we'll be chatting about some of the upcoming obvious federal election spending that's happening, or the campaign promises that are already being made, as well as just what's going on around BC when it comes to the fires, as well as, well, we'll see what else is in the news. In any case, of course, always remember to like us on Facebook, follow us on YouTube, and take out a subscription online at the Western Standard, especially if you'd like to support independent journalism. We don't take any money from the government. We like to keep our information secure and sure and pure, and that requires that we not take any subsidies from the government. So it is viewers like yourself subscribing and helping us out that let us keep independent journalism alive and well in the free West. My opening statement for this morning dwells on the election looming. Obviously, a federal election is looming. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's appointment of the first Indigenous Governor General, I prefer First Nations or Indian myself, of course she's Inuit to be clear, was the opening volley of what promises to be an active summer of backyard barbecues and big spending announcements. In a few short weeks, having bought the support of the citizenry with its own money, the Liberals will ask for the writ to drop from Rideau Hall. So, as we all recall, basic constitutional rules, the Prime Minister goes to the Governor General, who is his own appointee often, depending on how far you are into your own term, and asks them to drop the writ, which is to say to dissolve Parliament. And now the Register of Parliament is cleared. Everybody who was an MP is no longer an MP. They are now just Joe Citizen. The bureaucracy takes over the government for the ensuing 6, 8, 10, 20 weeks, depending on how long you wanted to have your election for. And the now formerly elected members of government campaign for their seat once again in all of their boroughs, as it were, the rotten boroughs, their various constituencies, which are always in Canada, they're very interesting. You know, they're always something to something. You know, Prince George Peace River, Vancouver Central, Toronto Centre, Bulkley Valley, Nechako Lakes. It's always an interesting set of geographic features usually, and sometimes towns. Every few years, rather, well, not every few years, but we wish that our elections could be handled differently. In Canada, we are so well practiced at the art of lying, we hardly notice anyone's words until they start telling the truth. From the cost to doing business to taxation to the population at our disposal versus the vast resources that surround us, I should say small population. One might think a national strategy would be in order, but no party has produced one for decades. The current Liberal Party, as far as I can tell, really is what would have happened if all of the charisma of Trudeau Sr. had been combined with some of the audacity of Mackenzie King. William Lyon Mackenzie King, to be clear. That would be probably the simplest way to say it. I think that there is a bit of an ambition inside of the cabinet for kind of how they might reshape Canada. And I think that people pulling the strings behind Justin Trudeau are definitely, they're global minded, not Canadian minded, not nationalistic. They're globalists. But they also have a vision for how they might remake Canada in their own image. But they still don't have a national strategy. It still is, it's too urbanite. It doesn't have a clear way of developing northern Canada and non-urban parts of Canada. And it leaves urban parts of the country behind. So it's very, very liberal. It's just, and it does have a vision, but it's very much making it in its own image instead of seeing how could Canada work best for Canadians or for how Canada works, what it has at its disposal. Every few years, the party in power makes more promises and commitments on borrowed money, and a bizarre cross-section of do-gooders, browbeaters, and dependents vote for that party, which is usually, at the federal level, the Liberals. COVID, I think, will prove this pattern undeniably. Both the lowest and the highest did better than the middle during the virus, and they know who to re-elect. I think that's very clear. We can get into that in a moment. Imagine for a moment what would happen if we disallowed such campaigning. Before any new spending announcements were allowed, our elected leaders were forced to tour all the still unfinished projects of their last campaign. And what if they were forced to sit silently while an actuary read out the true cost and budget overrun, or a shop steward talked about injuries or deaths on the job? Or, if they had started a federal program, how badly that was going. just common citizens explaining to them how their dreams didn't materialize. The rules could be even simpler than that. If the Prime Minister, as well as other party leaders, were forced to tour the farthest reaches of Canada, the most downtrodden parts of cities, the places that have been left behind, former industrial towns that have been left to rot, the debates could be held in those places, or at least given primacy there. And what if real Canadians could cross-examine their elected officials? But the Canadian political scene is a closed loop and a predetermined narrative. As one good friend of the show often says, that would be Stuart Parker, the Canadian scene is captured. Insurgent candidates are not allowed to run. Problem MPs are dismissed. And what's left of our cabinet either takes its orders from the boys in short pants at the Prime Minister's office or has been intimidated into silence, even by foreign influence. No, it's pretty bleak out there, but we will need to improve it before too long. Otherwise, there won't be a country or even a part of the country if you're a sovereigntist to save. So I would say that's we've got a good morning from Northern Alberta. Hello, Sean Craig. Yeah, I would say that's kind of where I sit on this question right now. There is a federal election coming. That's clear. All the spending announcements are happening. We are going to have backyard barbecues, at least here in BC. I mean, we're basically wide open. I have no idea. I genuinely have no idea who's still obeying COVID rules anywhere. I don't know if those people exist. If you do, I don't know how to help you. Like when even Bonnie Henry and Horgan and Henry, they should start their own TV show. Actually, they did. It was called COVID. They did their daily updates. But someday when we all look back on this, like if even Horgan and Henry are basically throwing caution to the wind, I think that's the time where you have to just kind of lean into the government's lack of tyranny for 5 minutes and get as far as you can with it. So if you are still following the restrictions, I'm not saying don't wash your hands. I'm not saying lick the doorknobs. I'm just saying, if you want to wear a mask in a store, go ahead. Please, at this point, don't be wearing a mask in a car alone by yourself. Like, we get it. Your virtue's been signaled, or you just forgot you had it on. Just take it off. You're fine. You're going to be fine. And please don't walk around outside of it alone in the middle of nowhere with your mask on. Please don't do that. Don't give them everything. Leave a little bit of mystery, I think, is what grandmothers used to tell their granddaughters. Leave a little bit of your integrity as a citizen to yourself. Don't give it all away for free. But the point being that when it comes to federal election, here in British Columbia and perhaps elsewhere, when they finally kind of open up the rest of this country, there will be the whole backyard barbecue thing we do in Canada. We have a very different way of campaigning than the States, right? Because I mean, at the federal level, we elect we elect, of course, our representatives all at once. And in America, when it comes to their two elected branches of government, well, they're one branch, they're two elected parts. The Senate's elected in thirds, and their House of Representatives only sits for 2 years. It doesn't sit for 4. So every 2 years, it has to be reelected, which is interesting, very interesting. Whereas in our system, of course, Parliament could actually sit for very long. It just requires that. That we have. It requires that you have a dissolution of Parliament in order to get back to an election, right? So, what's interesting is that our system is very different than the States. And our election system is very different than the States too, because you really only get a very concentrated amount of writ period. Stephen Harper pulled an 80-day election or whatever, 72-day election, something like that, back in 15? Yeah. And that didn't work out for him very well. But the funny thing is that when you think about that election, and when you think about other elections, like in the end, Canadians prefer, a short, usually fall election. They've heard all the spending promises through the summer. They were half paying attention while their TV was on or off or whatever. And finally, they cast a ballot, usually in October, which does me one better than I think the States. I don't like that their elections in November. I don't know why it's in November and not a little bit earlier. I guess the States just have better weather than we do. So November means for them, it's like late autumn. And for us, it's like, no, that's winter. Most of Canada, that's winter. November doesn't look good. It looks ugly. And that's why we don't do November elections. And of course, we all remember the winter election, which I think was what, 06? Somebody can correct me on that. What are going to be the big issues inside of this upcoming federal election? Oh boy, there's going to be a few of them. One, of course, as we kind of leave COVID behind, that will very much go into the rear view, I think. People will have been so talked to death on it that don't care about it anymore. It's too much that they're going to get they're just that's going to be all but ignored, which is interesting because while I was in favor of the CERB, and I'll get into that in a minute, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, to be clear, I called it the CERB, by the way, most of the time, because I'm not French Canadian. I'm an English speaking Canadian, so I called it CERB, not CERB. But while we were all on that, whatever else, I was in favor of that at the time, and still remain in favor of the idea in general. But that doesn't mean that I don't know that the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit cost an egregious amount of money, and that is something that will have to be repaid. And how it's being repaid right now is, of course, there's still high taxation in this country. And for that matter, the inflation that happened through COVID is coming through the roof. So that's just taxation by another form. We all know that. If your dollar is worth less and your wage has gone down, or the percentile that they'll take off of us, in a sales tax item or whatever else, right? That percentile stays the same, but it goes up, right? You get more cents on the dollar if the price of the thing's been inflated because you take a percent of it, right? So if something was $10 and now it's $12 or $15, and you add, to make the numbers easy, 10%. Well, 10%, 10% of $10 was $1. That was $11 total when you paid for that item. When it's 12, it's $1.20. And when it's 15, it's $1.50. Well, all of a sudden you have a bunch of tax. You have a bunch of new tax, right? Because you took a percentage of what's happened with that cost of an item. So inflation is a hidden tax all the time. And of course, it also depresses wages, hurts their spending power, hurts spending parity inside of the various classes. And so I think that would be something we would talk about as Canadians if anybody gave a bleepity bleep about anything in this country that was serious when they're getting elected or when they're fighting for a campaign. And they would actually have to admit that runaway inflation is a really bad thing. Look at what happened to the cost of lumber in the last year. Look at the cost of housing. But I don't think those are going to be the issues that are brought up. They might talk a little bit about the affordability of housing, but that'll just be another subsidy or something to those who are already property. It is harder to get into property today than it is to continue to be in property today. I've gone over this before on the show. I was called a socialist what must be now months ago, a month or two ago, when I said that, we shouldn't have one man own 10 houses or one landlord own 10 houses so he can have his little slum. It should be 10 families owning 10 pieces of property, each with an individual, freestanding piece of property. And I got called a socialist for such a notion. I remember for saying that I didn't know how I would influence the market to do that, but I did want the market to allow that to happen. In Canada, it is getting easier and easier if you are already propertied, which is, let's be clear, you're not rich, right? Because you're just in debt like everybody else. And that's the other thing about being rich today. Being rich today, unless you are a part of that 1% class, most rich people today, I'd say somewhere in the range of 40 to 50% of what we call the rich today, maybe even more, are just as indebted as everybody else. They just happen to make more money, and they just have to be smarter with their money when it comes to the kind of debt they can do, and they hire the right accountants to get the right write-offs to pull it off. Like, they're not actually any richer in an actual numerical sense. They don't have a Scrooge McDuck vault full of money. Nobody does anymore, except for Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, because nobody has cash anymore to begin with. But further to that, everybody's leveraged. And that's not a good sign. That's a bad sign. If everybody's leveraged and you already have record low interest rates, tiny bump in the economy could send the whole thing crashing. Those are the kinds of things that ought to be talked about this election. They won't be talked about. Instead, what we're going to talk about are, like always, some big infrastructure projects. So Reid will be on in a few minutes, talk to us about what's going on in Vancouver. There was an announcement there not so long ago about, they're going to build a tunnel or something for the SkyTrain and all this jazz. And that's fine. Like, I mean, I like riding the SkyTrain when I'm in the Lower Mainland. It's nice getting onto the SkyTrain and just zipping around and not having to worry about driving everywhere. I've driven in the Lower Mainland. You don't want to drive in the Lower Mainland. It's egregious. It's not worth it. Don't bother. I literally will get up at like 3 a.m. in Prince George. If I have to travel to the Lower Mainland, I will get up at 3 or 4 a.m. to make sure that I hit them in the middle of the day, so that there's no one on the road. Everybody's at work, for those who still do something productive with their lives. And for that, I have to get up very early, so that I hit them in the middle of the day. If I don't get up early enough for that, I will, and you're trying to travel through the number 1 corridor, the Highway 1 corridor, anywhere, west of Abbotsford and all the way to the tip of Vancouver, between the hours of probably no later than 7 a.m. in the morning, no earlier than 9:30 in the morning, almost 10. The same in the afternoon, somewhere around 3:30 at the best, to around 6:30 at the latest, maybe even 7. You just don't want to travel during those times. If you try to get in and out during those times, you will be stuck in traffic. And so all the time you made up on the highway beforehand, you're stuck. So I'm totally okay with the idea of there being more SkyTrains in Vancouver. That I'm fine with. I don't really want to pay for it, but I understand why they're building them. But of course, that's what's kind of going on. Horgan is going to take pictures with Justin Trudeau because he wants Justin Trudeau to get reelected, because he can rely on Justin Trudeau. He can't rely on Jagmeet Singh. He can't rely on Aaron O'Toole, but he can rely on Justin Trudeau. So Horgan and his friends are going to go take pictures with the Liberal Party of Canada, because the Liberal Party of Canada is the de facto ruling party of this country, and that's who's in charge. So they're hoping they get reelected, because they know that means big checks, big checks for their projects, including Site C, probably. I'm guessing there's federal money that'll be headed for Site C eventually. I think, what else are we going to see in this coming election? We're going to see First Nations issues brought up a couple of times, especially because of the residential schools and all that jazz, but nothing will change. And that's a really sad fact, but there won't be. Maybe Trudeau talk about, finding potable water for reserves, but I doubt it. And what's kind of mind-boggling to me, to be perfectly candid with you, is that, like, I've been hearing about boil water advisories on reserves since I'm 31, right? And I remember hearing that. I was quite sentient as a child. Like, I was pretty aware at a young age. It's not a backdoor brag or anything. It just was. And we talked about political stuff from a very young age. My grandfather had been through the war on the wrong side. And so we talked about political stuff at a very young age. And I remember hearing about boil water advisories, etc., and warnings for reserves. It goes all the way back to the 90s. And I'm sure it goes beyond that. I'm sure somebody could tell me it goes beyond that. But I'm just sitting here going, like, I'm not even that old, and it's been there for my whole life. But I'm starting to get to the point where, some kid who I could barely legitimately be the father of, right? If you want to be honest about it, right? Yes. Was I biologically capable? Sure. But do you really want that to be the way you measure those things? No. But like children, like when I was substitute teaching too, I would say that to kids all the time. It's like, I'm barely old enough to be your father. Barely in any legitimate sense. But they'd still be looking at me like, oh, you're so old, you've done so much, you've been so many places or whatever. And I'm just sitting there looking at them like, maybe that's not a bad perspective when it comes to some of these political problems we have, because I'm old enough to remember boil watery advisories being here my whole life. It's kind of like, I remember the time before September 11th. And I can remember walking through airports without having to, strip down or put everything into a box and whatever else, have it all scanned. And I can remember smoking in restaurants. Not me personally, obviously. I was a child, but I can remember the smell of cigarettes in restaurants. And that's just a whole other world, a world that's gone. It's evaporated. And I think that's the other thing that's evaporated too when it comes to Canada is real discussions when we have an election. What are some real issues? Maybe we should throw that to the comments just while we are waiting for Reid to get on. He'll be here soon. But what would you like discussed throughout the election? What matters to you? What's the first thing on your priority? Is it the debt? Is it the economy? Is it coming out of COVID? Is it getting back to normalcy? Is it personal freedom? Is it personal expression? What do you think is the most important issue to be discussed this election? What is the topic for 2021 for this election? I've got a message here from Pamela Jones-Kenny. The politicians should be talking about China's creep across the West, the development of space weapons. Well, that's interesting. I don't know a lot about space weapons, except to say that they're weapons in space. But I can tell you that there is a treaty, right, that declares that space is supposed to be disarmed. And so if that treaty is being violated by anyone, including the United States, they should be reprimanded, obviously. But more importantly, when it comes to the question of China's influence in Canada, we need to understand that China has a large portion of our parliament captured. Our parliament is full of people that are, well, I'm just going to scoot over just an inch here. There we go. Our parliament is full of people who are either in league with or under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's because China knows that Canada is full of resources that they would like to exploit. And in order to exploit those resources, they need to have control of our parliamentary democracy. Do they have complete control? I don't think they have complete control, but I know for a fact that and people of the Conservative, the Liberal, and the New Democrat Party are all under the influence of the Chinese regime, one way or another. People bullied into silence, that sort of thing. A free piece of advice, if you're an elected official watching this, never go to China, ever. If you do go to China, bring your wife. And if you bring your wife, make sure you're with your wife at all times, and they don't get to slip you something and bring you into a room full of very likely underage concubines of all genders. I guess there's many genders nowadays, and take pictures of you that are embarrassing. Yeah, maybe just don't do that. Free piece of advice. I mean, we should never be going anywhere for the dancing girls. Going somewhere for the dancing girls is a lack of integrity if you're a man. I don't know if there's an equivalent for women. I'm sure there's dancing men somewhere. But it's one thing to be, one thing to indulge, I suppose, at a certain age, at a certain time, at a certain place. Still don't agree with it. I was raised against that. But I promise you that if you are somewhere far away from home and that temptation strikes you, and you happen to be an elected official on, somewhere in the mainland of the former five kingdoms, the five kingdoms under heaven, I would strongly suggest not giving into that temptation, because I promise you that evidence will be used against you, and you will be intimidated into doing exactly what they tell you to do. So, I mean, that's the question of China, but that's the other thing. China won't be discussed this election, not even by the Conservatives. Even the Conservatives aren't going to deal with China. And that's the sad thing. That's sad. What's the point of having an election if you can't have any real discussions? I'm going to go to the comments again here. We've got Sheldon Jones. Elections are frustrating for me. It seems the only points that get traction are the ones that involve spending money. I'm guessing we're coming out of COVID with $1 trillion in debt. Is there a plan other than taxation? No, there is no plan. There is no plan. The plan that we have in place right now is that there is no plan. If you talk to somebody like Stuart or a few other people on the left, they're going to tell you that there is no plan, and the plan is basically omnicide, right? And they're going to go off about climate change. I'm not going to make a judgment on that here, there, or anywhere. I really appreciate the contributions we have on the show and the contributors. I don't agree with everything, but I think they have important things to say. That's why we have them on the show. and it's very diverse opinion, and it's stuff you can't get anywhere else. Try getting that on the CBC. Try even getting that on the Rebel, for that matter, or any of our competition. Good luck. But what I'm going to try and draw here is that while on the left they'll talk about this and like the impending climate disaster, for us on the right, whatever the climate's doing, who knows? But what we can tell you is that there is a man-made structure, and it's called the economy. And the economy has rules, and those rules around supply, demand, and the nature of money, particularly monetary policy, they have very clear rules. And you can't go on forever dancing on the thin ice that we have built for decades now when it comes to the economy. You can't raise a family on a service sector job without some kind of money recycling. And the money recycling costs more than just paying that guy a higher wage. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I don't care if you're washing dishes. I don't care if you're a logger. I don't care if you're a CEO. If you need a family living wage, you need a family living wage. And that's it. That's how it is. But at the same time, we do it, and the way that we do that is we recycle the money, which costs more than the money, right? It's worth more. It costs more than what the money is worth. And so if you just gave people their checks back, you imagine what $15 an hour would pay if you didn't take a third of their check every tax, every payday, every 2 weeks. You imagine what $20 a month, $20 a week, $20 a day, $20 an hour. Wow, I need to find my proper approximation there. What $20 an hour would be, or $30 an hour would be if you weren't taking a third of their check every 2 weeks. It comes back to the question of taxation. I'm glad that Sheldon brought it up, because taxation is quite high in this country. It's egregious, actually, when it comes to tax. When you think about it, when you start putting all the math together, we'd probably pay, even at the lowest end of the spectrum, especially if you do smoke or indulge in anything in order to kind of, lessen the pain in your life, which I completely sympathize with, you're looking at still probably in the range of no less than 40% taxation, even at the lowest income bracket, when you really combine all the taxes. And in the highest income bracket, you're probably into the range of 60 and 70, right? Because you were taxed on your income, and now you're taxed on your spending, and the transfers of property cost taxes, and cars cost tax, like everything costs taxes. So it's huge. But yeah, so to Sheldon's point, we're going to be in huge debt, and our method is that there is no plan. There's no plan for anything what to do with hyperinflation. There's no plan for anything. Everybody is doing the spinning plates thing, and that comes all the way back to what I was saying in my opening statement. There is no plan, and there's no national strategy. There hasn't been a national strategy since basically Diefenbaker. Trudeau and Pearson remade this country in their own image, which is essentially what we're really rebelling against. If you're a sovereignist watching this show, you're essentially saying, I've had enough of the Pearson-Trudeau consensus. And for that matter, a lot of angry Indians like myself, people of Indigenous descent or First Nations or Inuit or however you want to say it, treated and non-treated, status, non-status, and Métis. The point is that if they could just get together on that issue, if you're a sovereignist and you can find your way to an Indigenous rally and try and talk sense to each other, right? Not talk past each other. I think there's a lot of cohesion there, because this country is not doing well in the kind of post-68 vision, post-67 vision that it's had of itself. And there's only one way forward, and that's to discard all of that nonsense, keep Toronto Centre where it belongs, which is in Toronto Centre, not preaching the good word to everything more than 20,000 people everywhere else in the country, and to have a national strategy which puts Canadians first, puts our resource development first, and makes a better country. Or else, piece of it are going to break off, and they are going to do that for themselves. So that's my opening bit of ranting, but we're going to go to Reid here and see what Reid has to tell us about today. And Reid is being added to the stream. Hello, Reid.
Hey.
All right. You can hear me loud and clear?
I can hear you perfectly.
All right. Awesome. Well, let's start from the top, Reid. What is on the news docket today?
Well, I'd say the big story in BC is the tragic collapsing of that crane in Kelowna that left an unconfirmed amount of people dead. RCMP says there are multiple deaths. Obviously, that's just absolutely tragic. I would say that's not exactly a news issue that a lot of discourse would revolve around. I think everyone would kind of agree that that's just tragic and that's the end of that. I wrote a story last night that was published today. There was a video where an arsonist, also in Kelowna, was caught on camera. I think I sent it to you, actually. I think that's probably a little more interesting to talk about, because that sort of ties in with the current situation of wildfires in BC and what the cause is, and so on. So maybe we could start with that.
Yeah, for sure. Let's hit the button here. Well, that's not reassuring.
Yeah, sir. I think I got a little bit of
Can
a
you hear
delay
me?
here. Yeah, it's I can hear you now. So I'll just try and work with that delay. But oh, where'd you go? Am I live right now?
Yeah, no, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay, I was like, suddenly I was alone on the stream. I was like, what's going on?
That's it. You're in charge now. You're in charge of the Mountain Standard Time. No, every
Yeah.
now and again, I don't know what it is. It's StreamYard. Every now and again, I have to leave the studio and then come back.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
that helps sync it up. I don't know why. Don't ask me. I'm not the producer.
Yeah, we can land someone on the moon. We can send people into space, but we can't get a stream to work properly.
I don't know what to do about it. But so there's this arsonist in Kelowna.
Mhm. Yeah, so he was arrested and released shortly after. So he was arrested on Saturday and released Sunday, which a lot of people are obviously unhappy with. But I think it sort of brings forth the question, as wildfires spark up all across the province, what is the cause of it? Is it, obviously in this case, if that spread, if it wasn't put out, it would have been human caused, but there is a lot of disagreement among what the cause is, whether it's climate change, whether it's just a natural process. What are your thoughts on that? When you see these wildfires popping off, what do you think? Because it happens every year, obviously.
I think there's a couple of things. On the one hand, it's always proper and good advice to assume negligence over maleficence, right? Or anybody acting out in an evil way. Not because there isn't evil in the world, but because the amount of coordination it takes in order to do a proper evil act of all sorts of levels is a lot, and people can be quite lazy. So that's negligence. A soggy cigarette butt does a lot more than probably even the most voracious arsonist, depending on where you are. However, I have long suspected and theorized, even on the show, that if you wanted to destabilize a country or you wanted to commit a terrorist act, forest fires are perfect methodology, right? They leave zero evidence of what you've done. They happen all the time naturally anyway, so who's to know what's going on and what isn't going on? They cause wanton destruction. They cost billions of dollars in damage and emergency response and everything. They're just brilliant. They are a brilliant tool. And if you were a foreign power that was attempting to kind of knock about this country or this province, and bandy about a bit and kind of assert your dominance, or at least put them off kilter. It's a brilliant strategy. You can't argue with that strategy as a kind of shadow tactics or not a kind of guerrilla tactic sort of thing. It's brilliant. It's brilliant.
Yes. Some might say it's almost as brilliant as a virus. But yeah, because I noticed, like, I sent you that clip of Catherine McKenna, the Minister of Infrastructure, and obviously she was speaking when Trudeau was in BC late last week, and she even said, I have the quote here. She starts talking about climate change and the dangers of climate change, and she's like, well, we've all seen what happened to Lytton. So maybe the fire in Lytton is a direct result of climate change, maybe, but it seems to me that there's an obvious, it's obvious that they're trying to push that narrative. And again, I'm not going to get into the conversation of, carbon emissions and how much of an impact that has on the heating of the environment. To me, that doesn't matter, because it seems so transparent like climate change and pushing the fear of climate change seems so evidently like the next move now that COVID is dissipating into the background. And would you actually be able to play that clip that I sent you real quick? I think, yeah,
absolutely. Oh, no, that's the producer. Never mind. Here we go. Go press the play button.
So I'm reading the people in the comments here saying that they can't hear the audio.
Do you have a quote for us then, Reid?
Yeah, I mean, I guess people can just go and look themselves. But I mean, basically, she's saying, she kind of throws this thing out there about, she's talking about transit, and then she just changes the conversation to vaccinations, and she's like, oh, well, I know we're talking about transit, but just a reminder, everybody get your double vaccination so we can put COVID behind us. But the truth is, COVID will go behind us, she goes on to say. And then she says, but the truth is, the climate crisis is, we still have a lot of work to do there. So it's like, it almost seems like they're not even trying to hide it anymore. It's just like, this is COVID, this virus, was sort of the selling point and the main narrative in the media and politicians. And now that that's going away, they're sort of switching to this next thing. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw climate lockdowns a couple years into the future. I mean, I actually would expect politicians to try and make that happen if they can. I mean, if you started talking about vaccine passports a year ago, people would have called you a conspiracy theorist. And now, it's quite possible. And we're actually starting to see that creep in a little bit. How far it will go is not yet to be determined. But I mean, I expect the same thing to be applied to climate change. And again, let's say carbon emissions are the number one cause of the world heating up, and that's a real problem that we need to fix. To me, politicians and government are not the ones to do that, because it seems so obvious that all they care about is instilling fear. As a matter of fact, I would assume that they actually want it to be a problem, if that makes sense.
I mean, a crisis always means you get crisis management people, right? So as soon as something goes wrong, then somebody who feels like being a hero or pretending to be one can show up and start saving people. So I mean,
Mhm.
it's a self-perpetuating problem. I agree, and we see this in the family. We see this in individuals and groups. See it in group projects at university, for that matter. You see it in a bachelor party. Like, so no wonder you'd see it at the level of a nation, because all a nation is several small families and all the individuals within it making up its political body. So I'm not surprised that there's been this pivot. I'm actually in the middle of writing a column on this point because I'm trying to give a proper valediction, to use that word, a proper goodbye to COVID and a kind of epilogue to that whole episode, and an obituary in a sense of like, what was that like from a son of privilege to a certain extent, but a son of privilege who was also dismissed due to COVID from his burgeoning career at that time. So I became part of the underclass in that sense. So just kind of some perspective on that. I'm still trying to flesh that out. But to your point, like, there's been a complete pivot, and COVID has evaporated. It's gone in a puff of smoke of the wildfires and the church fires, and it's gone. Like, it's gone. Like, it's just, and certainly here in BC, I mean, there's a bunch of people still wearing masks in a bunch of different corners of the province. I have no idea why or what they're doing, but I mean, whatever, good for you. You do you, like, that's fine. But we don't talk about COVID anymore. The signs are going to start peeling off the doors. The tape that was holding them off is going to be a weird reminder that we're going to see a mask blowing by in a parking lot and be like, what the hell is that? And it's like, oh yeah, I remember that. As it just, like this is yesterday's news. And now, as you just pointed out, McKenna is pivoting immediately into the climate change thing. So it was, hey, look, wasn't that great that we got over this other crisis? By the way, there's a new crisis. It also starts with C, and here we go. And off you go, right?
Yeah, and it just seems to me, it seems so obvious that it's like they're not even trying to hide it. And you'll notice a lot of the time they use very like dramatic, inflammatory language, and I actually believe that's intentional because they know how much that's going to irritate a lot of people, especially when they start inserting like identity politics, which we saw with COVID. And of course, you see Catherine McKenna, later on in her talk, she starts talking about how, much like COVID, climate change disproportionately impacts, racialized communities and this and that. And, maybe there's something to that. Like, I'm not going to dismiss that. But the fact is, it just seems very obvious to me. Just reading the comment there. Yeah, no, I completely agree with Brenda. So they'll use this inflammatory language, and I think they're happy if people become divided, and sort of that polarization in culture starts to further accentuate. And like you said, it comes down to families, for example. I mean, I see it myself, and I got friends that won't even talk to each other anymore, and families that they have like this really dramatic beef because of a topic like climate change or COVID, and I think that's all sort of, I wouldn't say it's maybe it's just a byproduct, but I believe that it's intentional, because that animosity is actually very beneficial for people in power. It's like what happened down in the States. The storming of Capitol Hill on January 6th was the best thing that could have happened to the Democrats. And so I think division is not a byproduct of a topic like COVID or climate change. I think it's very intentional.
I agree in the sense that, if you can control the other people's narrative, even their opposition to the narrative, then all of a sudden you have total control, right? It's one thing to try and persecute or stomp out or extinguish an entire group of people, politically or otherwise. But if you can also just have them be completely ineffective, and that way you kind of keep them encamped there, they're completely ineffective. And so the real opposition can never materialize because you have this already occupied space that's completely ineffective. I mean, the left talks about the right doing this to them when it comes to questions of environment. They see the protests and the whiteboard the whiteboard brainstorming people and the finger sandwich people and the meeting people and the consultants. They see that as all an industrialized class of rentiers that also do nothing but just waste time and do not actually stop the things they're trying to stop. And for us on the right, it's about the same going the other way of we on the right feel like our political voice has been completely taken from us, and no amount of holding a sign about, all lives mattering, including the babies' lives, the unborn babies' lives, or gun rights being important, or my right of religion being important. Like, we feel that those spaces are also occupied by people who don't seem to get very far with those projects. Those have been projects for 30 years. They have not moved forward in that time.
Yeah, and it really comes down to just conversation, like you mentioned, the abortion conversation. I don't think there's a more inflammatory topic than that. And you'll hear people say, like, oh, how dare you be against abortion? It's a woman's right to choose and everything like that. And again, I'm not gonna pick a side in that debate right now, but these people, they just make these statements without thinking about the underlying logic of their statement. It's like, okay, so when does life begin? Does it begin at conception? Does it begin in the first, second, or third trimester? Because a lot of the time I try and apply I guess what you would call like the Socratic method, where you just ask questions. So like I'll ask someone, hey, when does it become life? And, like, could you abort that child, 5 minutes before it was born? Is it a baby then? And most of the time they're appalled and they're like, well, no, of course not. And it's like, well, where do you draw that line, and what's your reasoning behind it? And I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm just saying they haven't obviously thought through the discussion very well. And it's the same thing with COVID and climate change. It's like I'll hear Catherine McKenna talking, and then she'll just throw out how of course it's disproportionately affecting racialized communities. And immediately, like, my blood pressure rises a little bit, and I'm like, okay, like maybe you are right, but you can't just say that and then move on. It's like, this is something we have to unpack.
It's gaslighting.
Yeah, these are complex issues. And she's no dummy. She's obviously a very smart person, so she's aware of what she's doing, which is why I think that's and again, it was the same thing with COVID, and now it's the same method that was applied. And again, you'll even see later in her talk, she says, we need to listen to science and scientists, and then just goes on from there. I mean, that sure sounds familiar.
Yeah, it does. You need to listen to the experts. I think Scott Adams put this very well. And of course, Scott Adams got completely lambasted by the left when he correctly predicted that Trump was going to win the 2016 election. And how he was going to win and why. And so he got lambasted by the left, abandoned by the left, after being kind of like their token funny atheistic guy. A lot of not funny atheistic guys on the left nowadays, but their token funny, sardonic, atheistic, I just tell it how it is, just straight talking sort of guy, right, from California.
Yeah.
And of course, the writer of Dilbert. But he put it well that, when it came to COVID and that sort of thing, he actually gave Trump a pretty high grade. I was watching him right at the end of 2020, kind of as he was doing the aftermath of the election and everything else. But he did this really brilliant thing where he just said, look, like, I mean, of course you consult the experts first. First, you get to read from them first. You ask an engineer first about structural integrity. You ask your doctor first. Like, you do that first, but then you have to make your own risk management plan, right? Can you just cobble this together? Can you take the cheaper option? Can you kind of, just kind of work something here and make it happen? And do you have the money for this right now, or you're going to have to do it later? Like, that's what it is. And you just, cost benefit sort of analysis, right? I mean, and maybe it sounds kind of brutal maybe, but it's like, no, like, people have the right to think about that, even when it comes down to their own lives, for that matter. Right. And they shouldn't take that for granted in the life of others, but for their own lives, they really do have a right to think about that and what really makes sense. Like, I can either die on my feet, or I can barely scrape by on my hands and knees. Like, they might choose to try and tough it out and see what happens, and see if they do get that one over, they overcome that threshold. And so I think that when we're talking about this stuff, in consulting the experts. Like that was the thing that really threw me for a loop when it came to COVID. It felt like the experts were wrong all the time. All the
Well,
time.
yeah, and again, those are the experts that they're choosing to listen to. It's like if you're gonna just say let's listen to the experts, it's like all right, well, it turns out that there's a lot of diversity in the realm of what I would consider experts. I mean, like let's look at Kary Mullis, the guy, the Nobel Peace Prize, Nobel laureate winning chemist who invented the PCR test. He said himself that it wasn't intended to be used as a diagnostic tool. And, the amount of cycles that you're spinning it at is very important because, in BC, I think we were spinning it at 35 cycles. Ontario was 40, which maybe could explain why you were seeing more infections there. Maybe yes, maybe no. But my point is that, here's an expert that's saying that the mechanism you're using to determine the amount of positive cases and to determine the amount of deaths is not intended to be used as a diagnostic tool, especially when you're spinning it at such a high threshold. So why aren't we listening to him? Because it doesn't fit in with the narrative. And that was we're kind of digressing back to COVID here, but that really rubbed me the wrong way when you look at all these death with COVID, 262 more deaths from COVID. It's like, no, that just means that they tested positive with a mechanism that has no business being used as a diagnostic tool. I mean, he said himself, you spin this thing high enough, you'll find anything. And it doesn't differentiate between whether it's inactive or active viral DNA. It could just be dead viral DNA from 4 weeks ago. So yeah, again, no one's talking about this, of course, or very few people.
Of course not. But this is so what's gone wrong here? And I mean, it's funny that we're getting into this. I'm not sure. It's always fun to get to know people on this count, Reid, because I mean, you and I aren't super familiar with each other, but obviously we have some philosophical leanings that are very, very closely attuned, and we both have investigative minds around this stuff, and we're not just going to go with the narrative and bow ourselves off the cliff edge with the rest of the sheep. That would be silly. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's the question becomes very quickly, if this was the case, and the case was that the test wasn't reliable, why couldn't someone just come out and admit that? That's the thing that bothers me. Like I'm trying to think of the things I've tried to get away with in my life, and every now and then I've gotten a white lie here, there, and everywhere, and everybody's fibbed their way through something, whether it's with their significant other or their local priest or whatever. Like we've all done this. We all and maybe we didn't say exactly what a car was worth when we transferred it to a friend, and they saved $200 in tax. Like, okay, fine, everyone puts their thumb on the scale or takes it off the scale for that matter. But when you're going to straight up just tell us from all your expertise and all your post nominals that you're completely right about this test, and people can literally see the evidence that this test doesn't work. At what point does someone just say, no, dude, like the emperor has no clothes. Like you've got to tell the truth about it. You can't keep lying about it. Everybody knows.
Yeah. And the reason that they don't is because they know that they don't have to. They just pump that narrative out there in a very dramatic way, and a large percentage of the population will just unconditionally listen to that and demand that everybody else basically appeal to their fear. It's like, if it's like if you go into a store, just one person is terrified of COVID, they'll demand that everybody puts a face covering on. So, and again, it's like when like I said before with climate change, how Catherine McKenna was like, oh yeah, it disproportionately affects racialized or communities. It's like we saw with COVID, people were saying it disproportionately affects Black people, and it's like, well, maybe we should think about the fact that people with darker skin absorb less vitamin D, and there's been some studies that come out that directly correlate like your the level of vitamin D you have in your system with the severity of symptoms when it comes to COVID. Maybe we can dismiss that after. It's quite possible that's the case, but we need to talk about it first. We need to have that conversation and then dismiss it. But it's like you even bring that up. It was like the wage gap conversation back in the day. It was like, there's less women represented in XYZ. It's like, well, yes, maybe there's reason for that. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to go work at an oil rig where I come back a month later and I might be missing a finger. It's like, and then you bring in the pregnancy thing and they can't work for 9 months or longer. So it's all just dramatic inflammatory statements like COVID disproportionately affects Black people. Climate change disproportionately affects, Indigenous people and minorities. There's not enough women represented in the workforce. Therefore, it's because society is structured in a way that keeps those people down, as opposed to maybe it's partially that, maybe there's a more rational explanation. But of course, there's no real conversation.
And there isn't a real conversation, but the reason that there isn't a real conversation is not only are we becoming more and more literate, and we're becoming more and more literate. We're going back to using, emojis and everything else, which means we're going back to pictograms, really, is what that means. We're going away from phonetic language and the nuances of allusion and metaphor back to cartoons being used as language, which I mean has its place to a point, but there we are. But the other side of the reason we can't have these conversations, people think it has to do with education, that sort of thing. We're more educated than we've ever been, so that can't be true. I think that it has to do with a fundamental misconception about the world by much of the leadership, to be clear, which is that they are correct, or they have the truth, they have the orthodox truth, the holy writ of truth, and that isn't up for debate. And so everything is about conformity. It isn't about lively debate within a political party. It's not about a lively debate within your political structures. People who are problem MPs are tossed out. People who speak back against the leader are tossed out. People who seek nomination races and are trying to get elected, they if they have any kind of insurgent qualities, they are tossed out and given no reason. So we can't have real conversations anymore because we're building a world where real conversations don't exist. We have conversations about conversations. I think one of my contributors, Stuart Parker, puts it that way. So it's about tone police. It's all about it's about the tone of the conversation, not the conversation itself.
Yeah, no, I really enjoy listening to Stuart's and Aaron Eckman as well. But yeah, I remember Stuart was talking about how, political parties, they look into your past and they want to make sure that you didn't stand up to a superior or anything like that. They don't want any qualities that show you're willing to sort of be the nail that sticks up, But yeah, no, and again, it's and that's why that's why identity politics is so effective, because it's such an easy way to dismiss people that stand up. It's like, for me, having my perspectives, people can just say, oh, well, you're a cisgendered white male. Therefore, you can't speak outside of this box. So instead of actually critiquing and picking apart sort of the logic of what I'm saying and really trying to understand it and dismantle it, they just say, oh, well, you belong to this group, therefore you really have no way of knowing, and you don't get to speak on the matter. So it's really effective. Identity politics makes perfect sense if you're trying to crush dissent. And of course, people can be split into multiple identities, so you can usually find some axis along which someone would belong to, what they would consider the oppressor class, to use a Marxist term. It doesn't matter, like, if you're a black man, you're still a man, and maybe you're straight, so it's like there's always going to be something. It's like straight, male, white, wealth. Um, there's always some axis along which you can apply someone to the oppressor class, which is also the same tactic that was used in the Red Terror in the Soviet Union. And it was very easy to, maybe it was, there was no clear line between the bourgeoisie and the proletariats, and you could sort of pick and choose to fit your narrative, which is why I think it was such a corrupt ideology. So, yeah.
No, I think the other thing that's gone wrong too, and this is something, I mean, I'm a social conservative for many reasons, but I'm very traditionalist. I was raised Protestant. I became Roman Catholic in my 20s while I was attending Trinity Western in Langley down there. And so for me, one of the things that's important to me is to kind of see the map in people's minds, the paradigm shifts that have happened over the years. And one of the things that I think we've come to is it only took, in my opinion, another 500 years. The argument of the Reformation was that, selling indulgences and all this had to stop because you can't do that. You had to actually have a sincere commitment to, our Savior, and therefore you could be saved. And that was by his grace alone. It wasn't by anything you could do on your part. And this kind of democratized the faith to a certain extent. I disagree with other elements of the Reformation, but I understand what their central premise was, and I understand why they were angry. But 500 years later, we live in another theocracy where, supposedly climate credits are going to save the planet. So instead of paying for some indulgences of the souls in purgatory, you are now paying for climate credits. You're now paying a climate tax. And the experts who are our high priests and theologians of our time explain to us that it's a great mystery and we will never understand it ourselves, but trust us, this is how things go. And this was the other thing with COVID. COVID was indeed a technocratic theocracy. It was a religion. Right, the edicts of it changed all the time. They had to be followed immediately. We might as well have been in Iran. Like if people have to walk on their hands in Iran tomorrow, they really will try. Certainly in North Korea, they'll give it a go. And in Canada, out of nowhere, after a long legacy of freedom, we have our French speaking part, which I have a great deal of respect for in its own right, and it's French culture, but we are also an English speaking nation with English speaking liberties. The English speaking peoples have liberties that go back 800 years plus. And yet we gave up all of our ordered liberty in about 15 minutes, thanks to a virus that had the lethality rate of far less than what everybody had told us it would. And it was gone. It was gone. And people wouldn't stand up for themselves. They're still not standing up for themselves. They've been released back into the wild, and they can wear a mask or not wear a mask or whatever. But to this day, people are still acting as if that was perfectly normal and it all made sense and there was nothing to worry about. And that's just it. Like we live in this time where we have kind of it is very much like a theocracy. This divine reality above us that cannot be interpreted by the little people at all. And the experts, the high priests, they put things forward that unelected always civil servants and experts and scientists and doctors. And they tell us how we have to live. And then our politicians conform in order and show virtue with their virtue signaling and all their gaslighting to earn their salvation in front of everybody else. And that seems to be where we're at.
Yeah, and again, people love to criticize religion, and fair enough. I just think that they're focusing on the wrong thing. The problem isn't religion; it's dogma. And dogma has the potential to overtake anything, whether it's a religion or a scientific field, anything anything like that. So, it really has become. It really did become a religion. And as far as climate change goes, I can just imagine the Canadian politicians licking their lips right now at what they're going to do with climate change after, the last year and a half regarding COVID. So, yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, and I think that's just it. It showed so much power. I think maybe one point to kind of brick back to here is the point that you were raising earlier about it being very divisive. I in my previous life, that is to say a few minutes ago when I was still writing for the local paper here in Prince George, after the January 6th riot, as I was their token pro-Trump guy, I was dismissed without any explanation, really. They just said it needed to be a parting of ways. And I had run into a bit of censorship at the very end of 2020. It was interesting. My editor had always been a kind of left-leaning civil libertarian, and I had a lot of respect for him. I still have respect for him, but it seemed like, I guess, from higher ups, he had gotten some pressure, and quite frankly, we had lost editorial continuity between the two of us, and we were also divided by what had happened, both in the States and throughout the world with COVID. But one of the points I got to raise as I was in my last few days there was that COVID really was the great winnowing fork. It was the biblical winnowing fork that's talked about. I was up north in Churchill, Manitoba. I got to experience the last COVID-free summer. What we're just experiencing now in some quarters of BC was my summer in Churchill, Manitoba. There were no masks at the bar. We didn't worry about any of this stuff. Most of that news sounded like a war far, far away from us. None of it really mattered. If you had to go to the hospital up there, the little Emerge hospital thing they have, everybody who entered had to take the test. I never got sick. I never had any problems, so I never bothered taking the test. But yes, they tested everyone. They never had a positive test come out of Churchill, Manitoba. And to this, I have no idea if they have any record of cases. When I wrote that, after being gone for a month, beginning December was when I wrote that column, they still had 0 recorded cases in Churchill. And it's a hub. It has a lot of people come through it because that's the gateway to the north. But the point is that as I kind of was writing it, I'm like, look, people had lived up here in a northern town, kind of the very edge of Canada, as we know, contiguous Canada, the 10 provinces together, and then the rest of the Great White North and everything else that goes on up there. That's just a totally other world. This is the border. This is the edge. This is the last stop, literally, before the Hudson's Bay on the rail line. So this is the edge of the contiguous Canada that we know. And in that little community, people had, gone through Afghanistan. They had gone through, the various movements of the 60s. They had gone through, the changes that had been brought by the 80s and the port doing well, the port doing badly. There were many things that had struck that community, and it couldn't divide it. And then COVID hit, and that had people at each other. And like they finally found the magical formula to have people at each other. I'm not saying there were street fights, but like there was some moments of people accosting each other in the store, and they finally found it. They found the magical tool to finally divide a community that otherwise, yes, they didn't all vote the same way politically. Yes, they went to different churches. Yes, they were different colors and different creeds and all sorts of things. There's actually a LGBTQ community up there as well, and some very straight-laced people up there as well, and they all managed to coexist. But it was COVID that drove a wedge in there and managed to leave people pretty bitter and divided.
Absolutely. I mean, I've seen some of the most tight-knit of circles become divided over that subject. I mean, there's people I know personally, whether friends or in my extended family, it's just kind of like now it's a known thing that like we just don't talk about COVID. It's like, and again, that's, at least I don't think that's me that's bringing that down. I mean, I'm someone who likes to have conversations, and I take pride in my ability to be emotionally detached during conversation, and I'm willing to admit that I'm most likely wrong about a lot of the things I say. Again, I'm not married to any of my ideas, so I think it's an important thing to talk about. But people have just gotten so emotional, and it's a result of fear. And this comes back to the powers that be. They know if they can make people afraid, they can have their way with them, and that's a tale as old as time.
Absolutely, it is. Absolutely it is. Well, Reid, I'm very thankful for your contributions here today, and do come back again soon. We'd be happy to have you on every Tuesday. I know that might not be practical, but do come back as frequently as you can so that you can bring us up to speed on what's happening in the wider world, and share your thoughts with us. They're always valuable.
Well, absolutely. And I just want to say real quick, my criticisms earlier of Marxist ideology and sort of drawing those parallels to identity politics that we're seeing right now. I realize that I've heard Aaron Eckman talk about it in the past, and he doesn't quite agree with that parallel. So I'd be curious to jump on with him sometime, and I feel like he might be able to really kind of break that down for me and potentially expose some of the flaws in my thinking. But yeah, no, thanks for having me. Thanks to everybody that's listening. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Of course, Reid. Absolutely.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you. But I think that the thing that needs to be understood in all this is again, it comes back to power. And I think Reid's right when the question of fear, right? Sheldon's going to give me a rating on my hair. I just know it. It comes back to fear. He's not wrong about that, but it also comes back to power. And the problem becomes very quickly, like, if you don't know what you're doing and you're scared of the fact that you don't know what you're doing and that you're in charge, you can act quite tyrannical quite quickly. This is not a controversial statement, right? Like, I mean, probably some of the most terrifying moments for anybody are when you are suddenly in charge of something and you feel completely out of your depth, or suddenly responsible. We should say responsible for something and completely out of your depth. No, and Sheldon's not wrong. It is unruly today. I did everything I could without product. I never used product in my hair, but 7 out of 10. It is unruly today. I don't know what to do with it. I think I'll throw some more water in it after the show's over. The point being, though, that speaking of control, control is a big deal. Control is a big deal. And when you are given responsibility out of nowhere, and you don't know how to handle it, you have to make some very, very intelligent choices in that moment. I think the biggest thing that you have to make is an act of humility, and just say, look, like, you got to give yourself the grace to be a beginner, and that, no, things might be bad right now. We're in the middle of the firefight. We're in the middle of a disaster. We just lost our commanding officer. Dad just walked out the front door. We don't have our senior executive anymore. We can't get into contact with the point person for this project. You are now in charge. I think you have to just start with honestly admitting that you have no idea what you're doing, and that this is a bit of a panic, and you're not going to figure it all out in one day. You're going to need to defer to the expertise around you, and take in their ideas, be humble when you listen, and then come back with, okay, well, out of the options you're giving me, this makes the most sense, as far as I can tell. And you live with that decision. And certainly the other thing that needs to be noted is that for most of us, we didn't earn our talents, right? They came from somewhere else. For those of us who are social conservatives and religious, it came from above. For those of us who aren't, we must admit that there are different strokes for different folks, and certainly not every single aptitude a person has is something that they've honed and harnessed. It is something that was innate in them, and then grace builds on nature, to use that old Catholic turn of phrase. Practice makes perfect, but what you have to work with, it has to be there. And if it's not there, I'm never going to be Wayne Gretzky. I can barely skate. But Wayne Gretzky, I don't know if he even has a podcast or something. Maybe he does. But, I can talk all day by myself if I have to into this camera. I don't know if Wayne could do that. So this is the question, right? And we have aptitudes, and we build on those aptitudes, and we have to harness our talents as best we can, and then hopefully make a living from them, or leave them to our hobbies and go make a living doing something else, which we hopefully don't hate too much. But power and fear, they're a dangerous combination, because I think for a lot of our politicians, I think they're just as scared as we are. I think they're as scared of us as we are of them. But they feel a responsibility to rule us, which is their responsibility. They are supposed to rule us. That's why we elected them. But they just have no clue where to start. They have no clue what to do. They're somebody who's they're a parent with no training and no modeling for how to properly rule. Or maybe even worse, they have only abusive modeling for how to rule. And we have to try and help them course correct. I don't think we're ever not going to have a ruling class. I don't think we're ever not going to have elites in charge. But I've always believed that what we can do is convict their consciences and help their conscience be formed in such a way that, no, they want to have a kingdom of conscience. They want to have a country of conscience, and they don't want to just be tyrannical. I really believe that that's achievable, but that requires forming one's conscience, and to form one's conscience requires ethics that go a little bit beyond what HR might be telling you, just a little bit. So we'll get into that another time. We're going to break into some of the stuff that was sent to me by my producer. I apologize. Things are a little bit disorganized this morning. Got a good we got a good comment here from Sheldon. Human beings are born with different capacities. If they are free, they are not equal. If they are equal, they are not free. Yep, that's fair. And I've got a correction here from Suzanne Delane. Comes law, resistance becomes, that classic line. They were elected to govern, not rule. They are rulers. They are not rulers. They are public servants. Maybe I'm using those words too interchangeably, but I guess I also shy away from the word govern a little bit because I also was always taught, like management's a dirty word in my family, right? Because they're all professionals. They all work in, what would be called the professional class for sure, but they don't like to be identified with the managerial class. And the reason for that is that they have clinical experience. All the people on my father's side of the family, they are, and on my mother's side, they're tradesmen too, so they're not managers either. They don't manage other people who might be better experts than them. They are the experts. They are professionals. People with their trade or with their professional designation are hard workers who know what they're doing because of experience, because they get their hands dirty. And so in a sense, I guess when I say ruler, I'm thinking in a more monarchical sense because I am a monarchist. And it's like, no, like, I mean, it's your birthright to rule. That's what it is. But you are supposed to do that with good conscience. You're not supposed to do it incompetently. You're supposed to do it with humility, and you're supposed to love the people that you are in charge of. And you will answer for that at the end of time. You'll answer for that to God himself. And so the idea of governing, I'm not saying that governance has no place, but a governor is still detached in the sense that he's not ultimately responsible. He's just managing the affairs of state. He's not the state. He's managing the affairs of state. I think Louis, which one was it? Was it the 13th or 16th or whatever? I think he wasn't quite wrong when he said, I am the state. But he needed to say that with a good conscience, which was, if I am France and I must rule France as I would rule myself, which is with good conscience, with virtue and properly and healthily, and to make sure that the worst parts of me are made better and the best parts of me are shared by all, right? That's kind of what, that's kind of my point. But that's kind of my over idealistic way of looking at things. Again, I'm a monarchist, a Catholic monarchist, a traditionalist Catholic monarchist. So take that where you will. I'm going to go in the private chat here. We have a couple of items that were sent to me by our dear producer, who always looks after me very well. So he's there in the background on the show, helping me out, making sure things go where they're supposed to go. I'm going to close the rest of this stuff so I don't get it confused. Got Green Leader, Green Party moves Green. All right. Well, we're going to rant about the Green Party. Okay. Which is interesting because we don't have, by the way, we don't have Stuart on this week. Stuart is in a plane. He's in a plane off somewhere else later this week, so he is not able to come on the show. So just as an FYI, there will be no Stuart Parker this week, which is really too bad. I really enjoy me and Stuart's time. This is not happy. Hold on. Let's see. Here we go. We had to go to a different screen because they wanted me to sign into something that I don't have a subscription to. Hold on. Here we go. Share. Green Leader Anna May Paul muted in virtual meetings as she argued against sweeping cuts to party staff. Okay, so the war is continuing. Let's see here. Oop, nope. That's not going to work either. We're going to have to go to a different one. There we go. Green Party moves to block funding for Leader Anna May Paul riding campaign. Green Party executives have moved to withhold funding. Sorry, I'm not sharing my screen, am I? Hold on. There's only one that would come through. There we go. Green Party executives have moved to withhold funding from Leader Anna May Paul's campaign to win a downtown Toronto seat in a likely election later this year. 4 party sources who were granted anonymity because they were not authorized to speak publicly about internal matters say a motion was tabled at a federal council meeting on June 29th to hold back $250,000 previously earmarked for Paul's campaign in Toronto Centre. The motion has yet to pass, and Douglas Tingy, president of the Green Party of Canada Fund, says the party remains committed to supporting Toronto Centre to the best of his understanding. The specific details are confidential. Paul, who does not have a seat in the House of Commons, came in second to Liberal Marc Lechem in a by-election, replaced former Finance Minister Bill Morneau in Toronto Centre last fall. Passing the motion would mean fewer dollars to put forward advertising, research, and staff resources. The move to halt cash flow follows layoffs last week of about half the Greens employees amid party infighting and divides that bubbled in public view when New Brunswick MP Jenica Atwin view defected to the Liberals last month. Party's president interim executive director did not respond immediately to requests for comment. Okay, so why do we care? Why do we care about Sheldon's got a good joke there. Did Stuart offset his carbon with that flight? I'll ask him that when he gets back. I'm doing my best to keep my contributors happy, but you've got a good point there, Sheldon. All right, let's take a deep breath here and let's think about this for a minute. So let's review from past lessons on the Green Party. So luckily, we literally have a former leader of the Green Party as one of our contributors, who is again Stuart Parker. And what that allows us to know and to do is to kind of get an inside scoop into those progressive politics. So the interesting thing is that, as he stated in no uncertain terms, the Green Party has actually been really divided for a really, really, really long time. And there's been a lot of problems with the Green Party for decades. And so the point that he was trying to draw here is that Anna May Paul, in his opinion, was what he called a looter, or for that matter, basically a terrorist, a hostage taker, somebody who comes into an organization on totally false pretenses of like, look, I'm the professional, I'm the right symbol, I've got the right branding, I am what you need to win. I am who you need to get where you need to go. And you get overwhelmed by this sense of professionalism. Hey, if we buy this guy right now, we do this right now. Basically, it's a hack sell job. It's right. It's like you're not even selling your product, you're selling yourself. You're like, I am the product. Like, you got to trust me. You got to get with me, girl. If you get with me, you're going to have a good time. You get with me, you're going to be successful in business. You get with me, you're going to be, like, I'll get you all the office supply equipment you could ever want. I used to sell office supply equipment. So don't get after me as if that sounds like that's a punch down. It's not a punch down. It's a punch right in my own face. I used to sell that stuff. So the point that I'm trying to draw here, though, is that the short version of the story is that we know that, and Anna May Paul and the gang were her little group of people were all kind of dead set on getting involved with the Green Party of Canada in order to essentially loot it, in order to kind of further their own agenda, not do anything green related, not do anything about saving the environment, whatever else, to bring in their own kind of identitarian brand and kind of just have things go sideways with the Green Party. And what happened was, Anna May Paul, I believe, is a person of Jewish descent. And her staff member, who was quite clearly of Jewish descent, he had a last name that pretty clearly Hebrew or Israeli. And he made a point of trying to connect the intersectionalism that usually aligns with Palestine, right? Like that same kind of, there's gays for Palestine, all sorts of bizarre groups that are all together. I say bizarre, not necessarily because of their orientation. I say bizarre because their orientation wouldn't survive in Palestine, right? To be clear about that. Things don't go well for the LGBTQ community inside of Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza. But again, regardless, we put in air quotes intersectionalism that usually exists around that, which is exactly what it is. That's usually what exists. Black Lives Matter is going to be pro-Palestine. The LGBTQ crowd is going to be pro-Palestine. The climate change side is going to be pro-Palestine. There's this intersection of if you hear something that sounds kind of left-wing, that your kind of left-wing friends are all going to be kind of left-wing about it. They're all going to do the same thing. So, but she, out of nowhere, with her staff member, that staff member came out of nowhere and said, look, like we're going to also be pro-Israeli from a climate activist sort of perspective and that sort of thing. And that was not expected. Of course, it comes out of nowhere. It called for condemnation of that individual, and she didn't dismiss him, I don't think. And then the next thing that happened is she came out and said, "Well, the reason people are opposing me I'm a black woman, and I'm of Jewish descent, and I'm all sorts of things that obviously people are racists, and people are against me, and they hate me, and because they are against me and they hate me and they're intolerant of me, that's why they're coming after me." So she used that old identitarian argument that a lot of people are, we're all using it nowadays. Well, you just don't like me. I mean, but we used to do this on the playground. Well, you just don't like me because I'm a girl. It's like, well, you just don't like me because I'm a boy, because you think boys have cooties or whatever. And that all started, that all started some time ago. So we have with Anime Paul all sorts of funny things going on. And now we're into a part where there's literally the Green Party just tearing itself apart, trying to figure out whether or not they're going to stay or go. Are they going to stay with Anime Paul? Are they going to just give her the money and let her walk away? She's getting paid an enormous amount of money to be their leader, as Stuart alluded to us. And my beloved producer has managed to get all these things lined up. So we're going to jump back here and get some more stuff streamed. Got anything in the comments? Nope. Okay. Try again. This is why I have my producer help me with this stuff, because I am a total, what is it? It's not troglodyte, it's cave dweller. Luddite when it comes to this stuff. Anime Paul loses key staffers in Green Party layoffs. So let's see if the CBC gave her a bad treatment or not. Paul is facing a possible non-confidence vote later this month. Green Party layoffs are leaving leader Anime Paul without staff in her office as a feud between Paul and the party goes on. 3 sources affected by the cuts, who were granted anonymity because they were not authorized to speak publicly, say Green Party Executive Director Dana Taylor sent out the notices today, slashing the paid ranks of the party in half. The executive recently announced that at an all-staff meeting that some 15 layoffs are coming. That virtual gathering stalled after Taylor clicked Paul's mute button as the leader was speaking against the payroll cut. 2 other Greens refused to continue until she was unmuted again, according to the same 3 sources who were all there. Sources said the temporary layoffs took effect Friday evening, include no severance packages. They said the laid-off staffers might be asked to return to work if an election kicks on. The refusal would be considered tantamount to resignation. The cuts have included newer staff who came in since Paul was elected 9 months ago. Taylor and the leader's office did not immediately respond to requests for comment Wednesday. One thing we need to remember when it comes to corruption and people's terrible attitude towards things is that it always costs somebody else. That's the thing about theft, right? Theft isn't just stealing. Theft is the loss of for someone else, right? What's murder? Murder is the theft of life, right? You took somebody else's life. It was someone else's potential. It was someone else's everything, right? You took someone else's loved one. That's the thing, right? You're not just doing a +1 in your column of whatever it is. You are taking something away from somebody else, right? And usually the ramifications of that can be exponential, just like they're an exponential plus for you, right? I mean, if I get $1 million I didn't earn, and I spent 5 minutes getting it because I'm a, great hacker at bank cards or something. Well, right. I got a lot ahead while a lot of people lost something they tried to save up for a very long time. So that's the thing. And when it comes to looters and when it comes to these things, like, look at these poor staffers are getting laid off. I'm not saying that these staffers are all worthy of praise or something. And I'm sure some of them are real hacks, given that a lot of them came on after Anime Paul. But those are the ones who are getting punished. They should just punish her and dismiss maybe all of them all at once, or at least dismiss the leader who is most deserving first, maybe. But instead, of course, they're just going after her people instead of her, because for some reason they can't get rid of her. Well, they can get rid of her. I'm pretty sure they can dismiss the leader by a confidence vote within the executive very simply, but they're not doing it. And so now other people are suffering. Other people are scrambling. Other people are wondering where their next paycheck is going to come from. And that's the same thing when whenever, even when the SNC-Lavalin scam came up, I didn't want the engineers and the paper pushers throughout the ranks of SNC-Lavalin to get harmed. I wanted the CEO to answer for the terrible things it had done, right? But that's never the way it goes. Sheldon has a good question here. So what is Anime Paul's endgame? A new radical Democratic Party. Who are the donors now? It's a good question. What is her endgame? I don't know. I think I think it's actually kind of obvious what her end game is. Her end game is get the money, get paid, and get out, right? That's what she wants. She wants the money. So they probably need to just say, look, we would like you to voluntarily resign, and we're going to give you $150,000. And she'd probably take the money. I know I'd take the money, unless I actually had a principled place to stand on. But I don't know what's going to happen there. We'll keep watching that with interest, especially since the federal election's coming. We're going to deal with China. We're going to deal with ads natural security research funding. Harper. Well, we'll go take a jump to Harper here. So we're going to go to our favorite anti-Chinese, that is to say Chinese Communist Party, to be clear, the CCP. We're going to go to our favorite propaganda site where the various things that the Chinese are up to, that is to say, again, the Chinese Communist Party is up to, is properly discussed and dismissed and exposed to light. Here we are. Harper urges global powers not to negotiate with incoming Iranian regime. So, and this was actually by the Canadian press. It was just found on the Epoch Times. Governments around the world should shun Iran's incoming president based on the long-standing record of human rights abuse, a former Canadian Prime Minister argued Saturday in a speech to an international conference on the state of the Middle Eastern country. Stephen Harper's remark came at a virtual meeting of the Free Iran World Summit. Canada's 22nd Prime Minister told attendees that hardliner Ibrahim Raisi's rise to power is further evidence of escalating extremism at play in Iran. The judiciary chief is set to formally take power next month, becoming the first serving Iranian president sanctioned by the U.S. government even before entering office, in part of over his involvement in the mass execution of 1,000 political prisoners in 1988. Yeah, he sounds like a real winner, this guy. Ibrahim Raisi is a criminal guilty of crimes against humanity. He is a living symbol of the folly of trying to appease Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's regime, Harper said during his brief speech. Shame on any government in the world that would sit down and try to negotiate anything with an administration led by Ibrahim Raisi. Raisi, a protege of the Supreme Leader, vaulted to Iran's highest civilian position in a vote that saw historically low turnout after the strongest competition was disqualified by a panel under Khomeini. Harper said that this sham election shows how efforts to salvage the since tarnished 2015 nuclear deal with Tehran has only emboldened its extremist forces. Is there anything else to put there? But their deal floundered when Donald Trump pulled out of the agreement. President Joe Biden's team have made a U.S. return to the deal one of their top priorities. Raisi has rejected the possibility of meeting with Biden or opening negotiation. Interesting. Okay, let's get rid of that. So Harper is making his words felt and his noise felt. That's kind of what Harper gets up to nowadays. Every now and again, he kind of comes on as a statesman and shows up and says something sobering and then kind of wanders off back to wherever he was from, doing whatever he was up to with his Lego hair. Right now, I wish I had Lego hair because my not Lego hair is not doing what I want to do. But I think when it comes to Harper's remarks, I don't think he's wrong. Yeah, Iran's a terrible regime. Iran's an illegitimate state, and it shouldn't exist the way it is. But simultaneously, I mean, if America is going to continue to play ball with them, particularly the Democrats in America, right? For some reason, they want Iran to go nuclear. I have no idea why they want Iran to go nuclear, but they think about it. Sheldon's giving me some guff here. 6 out of 10 for Lego hair. Why anybody would want Iran to have nuclear weapons is beyond me, because I think that's a direct threat to Israel. And besides, the last time Iran tried to get nuclear weapons, we all know what happened. we all know what happened. Whether we want to say it was directly, I think at this point it's actually public knowledge that it was directly under the Israelis that this occurred. But the point is, various data mining occurred, and various strategic entry occurred, and some assassinations occurred, and eventually one of those half-finished reactors blew up and took everybody with it. And that's that. So, I mean, anytime that there's a threat to Israel that is that grave, Israel pulls itself together and takes it out. And that's kind of it. I don't really know what else to say. I truly don't understand who thinks this is a good idea. This is a terrible idea. And actually Pamela's got a point here. The hawks in the Biden administration like wars. You know what? I think it might be that simple, because I don't know if it is anything else. Because let's be clear, why else would you want to give Iran nuclear weapons than to start a war in the Middle East? Because that's just going to start another war. I don't trust Iran with nuclear weapons. You don't trust Iran with nuclear weapons. Nobody trusts Iran with nuclear weapons. The Chinese don't trust Iran with nuclear weapons. They're a situational ally to China. That's all Iran is a situational ally. It allows China to just use them as a wedge against the United States. Same as North Korea. Same in a way, not that the Chinese have particular love for the Indians, as to say India, the subcontinent, but they also use them as a wedge, or definitely make some dealings on the side to try and get India on side with certain projects. So China is surrounded by nuclear powers and the American nuclear umbrella, which covers Taiwan and Japan. And the Chinese have a whole bunch of unstable neighbors who have nuclear weapons. And I can't imagine why that's a good idea. And why would they want to add to that list? These unstable nations are not the people you want to have nuclear weapons. Unless you want a war. I think Pamela's right. Unless you want a war. So that's what's going on there. They want a war in the Middle East. Why? I don't know. I guess it pays big money to people who like war. I don't know. Okay, what's going on here? Ottawa adds national security risk assessments to federal funding research. Alrighty, let's share this screen. Ottawa, share. Alrighty. This is also by the Canadian Press. That's interesting. The federal government is setting new guidelines that work national security considerations into funding criteria for university research. Innovation Minister Francois-Philippe Champagne says research projects must now undergo a risk assessment as part of any grant application to the natural sciences and engineering research. He says the Research Council will then address and work how to mitigate any risks. Security questions around scientific research have drawn renewed attention after 2 scientists were escorted from the high-security National Microbiology Laboratory in Winnipeg in July 2019 and then fired earlier this year. Yeah. Yep. Well, I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory if you ask me. The short version of that story is that we know now basically for a fact. We know for a fact that those people were dismissed, and we know for nearly just dead short of certainty that they were working with the Chinese Communist Party of Canada, though there must be one of those too, of China. And that's exactly what's going on. What happened was in Winnipeg, we have a priority lab. I'm going to take a time out here for a second. I don't know if y'all ever been to Winnipeg. If anybody in the crowd here hasn't been to Winnipeg, you should go. And the reason you should go is that Winnipeg is this kind of bizarre place, which is like the last of what was Canada before the rest of the West was built, and the first of Canada of the rest of the West, right? Like, and it's our Chicago, like it's our Detroit, it's our, despite not having the lakes, though the lakes are just north of it, of course. But I mean, it's like it's our Midwestern town that's got a bit of that Midwestern flavor that isn't old Canada, Central Canada, Eastern Canada, but at the same time has got just enough of that old flavor to it that's still distinct in the West. It's pretty cool. So do visit Winnipeg. It's a good time. I've been there once or twice. It's a worthwhile city to visit. And it's got some fancy stuff there. It's got the Canadian Mint, for example, for servicing Western Canada anyways, and producing all of our loonies and toonies and all our other coins. And of course, clearly, it also has a virology lab. So like Winnipeg's not an unserious place. It's got some stuff, you know? So what the point I'm trying to make is that in that in that microbiology lab, sorry to be clear, there was clearly some agents of foreign powers that were doing research along with everybody else, contributing to the research, I guess, or at least taking notes from everybody and sending them home via wire transfer or something, right? Like sending home, clandestinely the research of what they were doing. And that's a problem because obviously it's kind of top secret stuff what's going on in a microbiology laboratory, especially if it did have anything to do with virology or infectious disease, or for that matter, possibility, because state governments are quite involved with building vaccines and that sort of thing and other pharmaceuticals. But it definitely is a high security risk. And so I'm glad to hear that Ottawa is actually putting that into basically SSHRC grants, whatever the equivalent is for science. I can't remember what that's called, but I remember SSHRC being a kind of somewhat dirty word when I was in university, because SSHRC was the social humanities investigation thing. Whatever. The point is, it's a research council, and you could apply to them for funding, especially if you were going into post-grad. So if you're going into either graduate studies of master's or PhD level. And the point is that they're going to have, for that same version, but for the engineering science side, the hard sciences side, that research council and grant authority is now going to review whether or not you might have a possible leak in your research that's going to a foreign power, because we don't want to pay for foreign powers research. So I think that we gotta be honest about that and know that there are foreign agents, foreign state actors on our shores. And that's something we need to recognize. And if we don't recognize that sooner rather than later, we're going to get into a lot of trouble. And hopefully we've learned it this time. So speaking of the Chinese Communist Party, we've got one last little item here that came to us from our lovely producer. Share. Canada calls on China to comply with South China Sea ruling. This is interesting. So as we all know, the South China Sea, which is located south of China, it's located, you're looking at a map of Southeast Asia, and the South China Sea, of course, is that part of the ocean that kind of comes off of the round part, the bottom right corner of China, right below Hong Kong, near Vietnam and Cambodia and all that jazz. That whole section there, that's the South China Sea, because all the rest of that is kind of the China Sea. And then there's the Sea of Japan over there by Korea and that sort of thing. But down south there, that's the China Sea, and this is the South China Sea. So here we go. Canada has called on China to comply with international law in the South China Sea based on a historic ruling by an arbitration tribunal 5 years ago that rejected Beijing's territorial claims in the region. Canada is particularly concerned by China's escalatory and destabilizing actions in the East and South China Sea, including recently off the Philippine coast, and by the militarization of disputed features and the use of naval, Coast Guard, maritime militia vessels to intimidate and threaten the ships of other states. Global Affairs Canada said in a statement on July 11th. On the fifth anniversary of the decision by the tribunal constituted under the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea, in the matter of the South China Sea arbitration, Canada reiterates the need for all involved parties to comply with it. China, which lays claim to most of the waters within the so-called 9-9, it's also contested by Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. On July 9th, they did not accept the 2016 ruling by the International Court at The Hague. Philippine Foreign Secretary Teodoro Locsin Jr. issued a statement on July 12th, asserting that the tribunal's decision is final. We firmly reject attempts to undermine it, nay, even erase it from law, history, and our collective memories. He added that the ruling serves as guidepost to littoral states, giving those states that enclose the South China Sea the latitude and boundary within which they can exercise their territorial rights, such as where their fishermen can fish, where they can exercise law enforcement patrols, where they can send their ships without permission from the nearest state, without creating cause for action or casus belli, of course, war. So reason for war between them. Meanwhile, Blinken issued a statement. Maritime claims completely unlawful. So we have to remember that there's a couple of different pieces here. They just like Russia being very assertive with its claims, especially to Ukraine and that sort of thing. China is essentially trying to lay claim to what's in the South China Sea, which are formerly called the Spratly Islands, and that's just, and there's little atolls in there, just like there's atolls all throughout the Ring of Fire, right, which we all recall from our geography classes. The Ring of Fire is, of course, all that volcanic substance and everything else. It's the reason why the Pacific Ocean looks like a giant ring, is because it follows the Chilean mountains, the Andes. It goes all the way up North America, all the way out to Alaska, all the way down from Vladivostok and through Korea and Japan and the east coast of China, and then down into the Philippines and all the way along Papua New Guinea and all of Oceania. And all those tiny little islands, Micronesia and New Caledonia, all in between. It all has to do with volcanic activity. We all remember that. So in the South China Sea, there are some islands that were formed from volcanic activity back in the day. They're little atolls or little tiny islands, and some of them are called the Spratly Islands. And China is basically just sending its ships there and establishing bases there and doing whatever it likes, because there wasn't a military presence there really before, except maybe during the last war, Second World War, and maybe during Vietnam briefly. But other than that, there isn't anything there. So what I'm trying to essentially give you as a version of this is that China's been asserting its territorial claims over this area for a long time, because, of course, if you are a state that has it in mind that you're going to dominate the world someday, all you can do is expand your territory. That's always the best. It's always the best choice. But as we say everywhere else in international relations, it's not over till it's over. And what China is doing is completely unlawful. But the problem with states is there's no police force to enforce the law upon states. And I'm talking about nation states. So unless the Americans are going to send an aircraft carrier into that area and basically sit there for a while and perform some exercises that explain in no uncertain terms that they're still the big boys in town, until that gets sorted, unfortunately, the Chinese are going to continue to run roughshod over everything. So, interesting. The producers put up one last thing for me here, but we are getting pretty close to the end of our hour. I'm going to quickly stream that. Share screen. It's coming to us from MSNBC, I guess. China. We are a near Arctic state and we want a polar Silk Road. China announced its official Arctic policy to the world late last month, promoting Beijing's ambitions for the region and raising fears about a Chinese takeover of the polar zone. But while the world's second largest economy, which identified as a near Arctic state, have its own interests, experts caution it doesn't mean a geopolitical standoff is coming. Well, that's nonsense. China, which is no closer to the Arctic than Poland is, has been working on its strategy an extended period of time. Its induction as an observer, the Arctic State Council approved in 2013. Yeah, they want in. I know that they're funding all sorts of stuff up there. Partnerships. There we go. Through the promise of investments and trade growth, China made sure to take diplomatic steps in courting the Arctic Council. The country entered into joint ventures with Russian gas companies, built a large embassy in Iceland. It helped finance the Kara Exile train in Finland, thawed its relations with Norway, and invested into Greenland. Coal become less reliant on Denmark. Mines of Greenland and Holland. Behavior today. China is able to provide financing for Arctic countries. Well, I mean, that's not news. We've all known about that for a long time. But the short version is, if you were scared of China before, just wait until you see them take over the polar ice caps. That's going to be really bad for us. So we'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. I'm going to put up my email here. Remember, if you've got anything you'd like us to talk about in Western Standard and on this show on Mountain Standard Time, please send it to me via this email. And actually, just before I forget, my producer just reminded me, we have one more thing we got to do. We have to talk about the coffee. Man, I just about forgot about the coffee. Resistance Coffee Company. I know this is coming at the end of the program, so hopefully that's not bad. But nonetheless, Resistance Coffee Company is based in Weyburn, Saskatchewan. And they, of course, roast their beans locally here in Canada, and they promote our freedoms. So their excess, if they have any, they take a small part of their profit and they put it towards increasing our freedoms, not decreasing them. They don't go for woke causes. They go for the causes that keep you free in Canada. That's Resistance Coffee Company. If you use our promo code Western Standard, you'll get 10% off your first order. Alrighty. Well, that was Mountain Standard Time today. And I just want to say thank you again for everybody tuning in. Please don't forget to send us any information you'd like us to cover and things that you'd like us to do, and how you'd like us to think about things, or what guests you'd like us to bring on. Hopefully we attend to those questions right away. But nonetheless, appreciate your viewership, appreciate your time, and hope to see you again soon. We'll be on tomorrow at 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain.